was home alone. My parents had gone away for the weekend, leaving me to look after the house and our cat named Murzik. Usually I enjoyed such moments of solitude, when you could do whatever you wanted without anyone saying a word. But that evening, something was wrong. The silence in the house seemed too thick, like in an abandoned crypt. The house was on the outskirts of the city, where you could count the neighbors on one hand. The sun had already disappeared below the horizon, and darkness enveloped everything like a blanket. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, trying to distract myself, but every rustle, every breath of wind outside the window made me start. Murzik was usually a calm cat. He loved lying on the couch and watching me with his amber eyes, but today his behavior was strange. He constantly roamed around the house, sniffing and looking warily towards the door. I tried to ignore it, but the anxiety gradually grew inside me, like a bubble ready to burst. I decided to order pizza and forgot about my fears for a while. Time dragged slowly, and I began to think that the night would pass quietly when it happened. A barely audible sound, as if someone or something was scratching at the door. I thought I was imagining things, but Murzik, who was lying on the floor, suddenly raised his head and hissed, his fur standing on end. I felt chills run down my spine. Approaching the door, I listened, but the sound disappeared. Maybe it was just the wind or a tree branch, but instinct told me that wasn't it. I looked through the peephole, but there was nothing. Emptiness. Returning to the living room, I tried to calm down. Maybe it was just my imagination. I sat back on the couch, turned on the TV, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Murzik wouldn't take his eyes off the door, his hissing growing louder, and I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. The scratching repeated. Now, it was louder and more insistent. My hand trembled as I approached the door again and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Emptiness. I slowly opened the door on the chain and peeked outside. The night was dark and moonless. The street empty. No one. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind. Something or someone was trying to get into my house. Murzik hissed again, his gaze fixed on the door. I decided not to leave it unchecked, and went to the back door to make sure everything was okay there. The scratching sound moved to the back door. This was too much. I grabbed my phone and tried to call my parents, but the signal was too weak, and the call wouldn't go through. A sense of helplessness washed over me. I didn't know what to do. Grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat, I slowly approached the back door and peeked outside. The backyard was quiet. The streetlight illuminated a small patch of ground, but beyond that, everything was shrouded in darkness. I stared into the darkness but saw nothing. Suddenly I heard a faint, almost indistinguishable sound, as if someone or something was hiding in the shadows. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the source of the sound. Someone was standing there, in the shadows of the trees. The figure was barely visible, but I could make out the outline of a person. My blood ran cold. Who could it be? My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I took a step back, not taking my eyes off the shadow. Murzik, sensing my tension, ran up to me and started hissing at the figure. I didn't know what to do. Panic overtook me and I ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I tried to calm down, but the fear was too strong. I sat in the living room, trembling with horror, trying to understand what was happening. The night dragged on, and I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every rustle made me jump. Murzik didn't leave my side, his eyes glinting in the dark. I knew I couldn't spend another night like this alone. I decided to check all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked. When I reached the kitchen, I saw it. Strange marks on the glass of the back door. They looked like fingerprints, but too long and thin. I felt a chill inside. This was something inhuman. I quickly closed the curtains and returned to the living room, trying not to think about what it could be. But that was just the beginning. Suddenly, I heard a loud knock on the window. It was insistent, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I approached the window and pulled back the curtain. There was no one outside, but strange marks were again left on the glass. I couldn't close my eyes all night. Scratching, knocking, Murzik's hissing, it all blended into one nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. I I sat in the chair, feeling panic slowly take over me. Murzik sat next to me, his eyes glinting in the dark. I didn't know what to do. Was it a hallucination? Or was something really trying to get into my house? By morning, I felt tired and exhausted. The scratching and knocking stopped, but the feeling of anxiety remained. I sat in the chair, trying to figure out what to do next. Murzik finally calmed down and settled back on the couch, but his eyes were still wary. That night will forever remain in my memory as the scariest night of my life. I never found out what or who tried to get into my house, but one thing I knew for sure, it was something I would never forget.